You know, of all of Shakespeare's plays, Macbeth is the one that's famously cursed. It's this bloody, dark tale of witches and ghosts and even a moving forest. But what if I told you the strangest part of this whole supernatural tragedy isn't the fiction, but the surprising bit of truth it's all built on? Let's dig in and uncover the real story.
The play is just filled with these exceptionally weird things, right? From prophecies to ghosts. And yet, it's supposedly based on a real Scottish king. So that brings us to the big question we're tackling today. Just how much of Shakespeare's very strange story is actually true?
The whole thing famously kicks off on this stormy, desolate heath with three witches. They get in the faces of these two generals, Macbeth and Banquo, and they plant these poisonous conspiratorial prophecies that just immediately get into their heads and start messing with their ambitions.
So the witches tell Macbeth he's going to be king, but then they give him this weird kind of get-out-of-jail-free card. He'll be totally safe until a forest, Birnam Wood, physically gets up and attacks his castle. And Macbeth just clings to this, thinking, well, that's impossible. I'm invincible.
And you know what? In the play's absolutely stunning climax, that is exactly what goes down. An invading army chops down branches from Birnam Wood to use as camouflage, and it creates this perfect illusion of a moving forest. It's like the prophecy comes true in the most literal, bonkers way you can imagine, leading right to Macbeth's downfall.
Okay, so if we strip away all the witchcraft and the moving forests, what's actually left? Let's get down to the documented history and find the real man at the center of this whole myth, a king named Macbethad.
You know, when you look at the real 11th century history, it's surprisingly simple. Basically, it boils down to just two key moments. In 1040, a general, Macbethad, kills King Duncan and takes the throne. Then, 17 years later, in 1057, Duncan's son, Malcolm, comes back and kills him. That's it. No witches, no ghosts, no walking forests. That is the simple kernel of truth at the heart of it all.
So that's the big question, right? How do we get from that, a pretty standard medieval power grab, the kind of thing that happened all the time back then, to Shakespeare's epic story of a paranoid, murderous tyrant being pushed around by supernatural forces? The answer, it turns out, is all about how history itself was written.
Well, the answer really comes down to this. People in the Middle Ages did not write history the way we do now, not even close. Historians back then were, well, they were basically storytellers, and each one had an agenda.
Think about it. For the 500 years between the real king's death and Shakespeare picking up his pen, the story of Macbeth was getting twisted and reshaped over and over again. You had clerics, chroniclers, poets, and they all used his reign as a kind of canvas to make moral arguments or to comment on the politics of their own time.
And what's really cool is we can actually trace how this myth got built, piece by piece over the centuries. Okay, so first up, in the 1380s, you've got this guy, John of Fordun. He's the one who turns Macbethad into the villain, mostly to make the current royal family look more legit. Then, Andrew of Wyntoun comes along and thinks, you know what this story needs? Witches and a moving forest. He was basically just trying to make it a more exciting read. And finally, Hector Bose adds that psychological layer of paranoia, turning the whole thing into a cautionary tale against tyranny for the kings of his day.
So, by the time Shakespeare gets his hands on this story, it's already a full-blown legend. And he takes it and, of course, gives it his own masterful spin. And he did it with one very, very important person in his audience in mind, the new King of England.
See, when Shakespeare wrote Macbeth, the new King of England was James I. And here's the kicker. He used to be James VI of Scotland, so he had a huge personal stake in this story. And, maybe most importantly for the play, he was totally obsessed with witchcraft. Like, he was terrified of it.
So it seems like a ton of Shakespeare's biggest changes were probably made just to flatter his new boss, the king. I mean, look at this. He pumped up the role of Banquo, who was supposedly King James's ancestor. Then he totally invents the prophecy that Banquo's kids would become kings, which is a direct shout-out to James's own family line. And of course, he cranks up the spooky, supernatural power of the witches, playing right into the king's well-known obsession.
But Shakespeare being Shakespeare, he didn't just stop at political flattery. No way. He added something way deeper, a kind of human complexity that none of the earlier versions ever touched. I mean, more than any version that came before, Shakespeare's Macbeth is completely at war with himself. He's this tormented, confused guy who's constantly questioning his own nature and the reality of what he's seeing.
Is he a nobleman or a monster? Are these witches even real, or are they just a projection of his own dark ambition?
And that all leads to the biggest question in the whole play, the one that really elevates it beyond simple history or myth. Is Macbeth actually in charge of his own destiny, or is he just a pawn? His legacy determined by these outside forces, by fates, by prophecy?
And here's the final brilliant twist. In making Macbeth question his own role in his story, Shakespeare created a character who mirrors the very historians who wrote and rewrote his legacy for centuries. And maybe that's why Shakespeare's version feels the truest, not because it's historically accurate, but because its protagonist, just like us, is trying to figure out his own place in the ever-changing currents of history. So it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Who really writes our stories? Is it us or the people who tell